Yeah, thank you. Yeah, good evening, and thank you for coming. First of all, of course, I would like to thank Benedikt, Freya, and Lee for giving me the opportunity to conceptualize this panel discussion for the Dislocation series. And also, of course, I would like to extend my gratitude to our guest speakers tonight, to Habiba Ensaf, Elia Horn, and Sayan Mani. So thank you for accepting our invitation. Yeah, as you have, as just Lee said in her introduction, my research focuses on the construction of Orientalist imaginaries, especially in relation to the reception of Indian art in Germany. And it's a great opportunity for me to conclude my research stay that I'm finishing now in Berlin by conceptualizing and moderating this panel discussion. Before I introduce our guest speakers, I've chosen an example from my own research to introduce our theme. An oil painting by the expressionist artist Ernst Ludwig Kirchner that many of you may be familiar with, as it houses in the Brücke Museum in Berlin. But before I begin, I must warn you that my presentation contains a sexualized image with racist connotations. And the reason for showing you this image is to critically analyze its construction, even if it means reproducing it. Yeah. Through a brief analysis of this oil painting, this oil painting by Kirchner, I'd like to offer you a glimpse into the phenomenon of Indomania and some of the dynamics and ideas involved in the construction of its Orientalist imaginary. As you can see in the slide, the painting Woman in a Bath depicts a group of 5 nude women in a natural setting soaking their feet in water. The origin of this monumental painting can be traced back to a sketch by Kirchner. This sketch, in turn, is a copy of a reproduction of the murals of Ajanta that Kirchner found in a book of the Ethnological Museum in Dresden, an institution that, as you know, already houses enormous amount of Indian and other non-Western cultural artifacts. The 2-volume book, The Paintings in the Buddhist Cave Temples of Ajanta, which, as you can see in the slide, was presented in our exhibition at the Brücke Museum, juxtaposed with the oil painting. This book is an example of the circulation of images within the framework of imperialist power dynamics. The caves of Ajanta, discovered according to Western historiography by British soldiers during a hunting expedition, comprise a Buddhist monastery and shrine complex containing numerous sculptures, reliefs, and what is believed to be the oldest wall paintings in South Asia. The project of copying the murals of this book, undertaken by the British painter John Griffiths, was part of the colonial project of systematically documenting the cultural goods of the empire and circulating them in the metropolis. In fact, as I've just said, Kirchner found Griffiths' book with reproductions of his copies in the library in Dresden. And as he did also with, for example, the Benin bronzes, he completed a series of more than 30 drawings based on the Ajanta murals, such as our sketch. For his drawing, Kirchner selected individual motifs from the Buddhist murals, mainly figures that were considered female with curly body shapes that responded to Western cliché of the particularly sexualized Oriental woman. Since the artist never traveled to India, he formed his image of the Indian people through travelogues and literature illustrations, or by visiting human zoos and exotic shows organized in cabarets and circuses in Germany, which reproduced a distorted image of India that corresponded to Western fantasies. This distortion can also be seen in Kirchner's oil painting, where he undresses the figures and adds stereotypical turbans, elements typical of Orientalist representations of odalisques, for example, or harem scenes. He also places the figures in a natural setting with a waterhole. The bathing scene is probably related to the summer stays of the Brücke artists at the Moritzburg lakes near Dresden and their own practice of nudism in search of contact with nature, and an idea also associated with India. In this way, Kirchner appropriated and recontextualizes his Indian sources, namely the Ajanta murals, according to the Orientalist imaginary and his own experiences and desires. As I wanted to show you with this example, although the German Empire had no colonial territories in South Asia, the circulation of images, texts, and cultural assets from the subcontinent had a profound impact on modern Germany. The Indomania, configured as a complex imaginary that oscillated between idealizing fascination and the racist exoticism, inherent and imperialist power imbalances. Today's roundtable takes a critical look at the phenomenon of Indomania in Germany. It investigates how Indian knowledge and culture have been appropriated with different motivations, and it focuses on colonial archives and museums collections to examine modes of display and cultural representation. Our discussion will reflect on how these imperialist histories and legacies from India can be approached and how counter-narratives can be imagined. And now I'm very pleased, finally, to introduce our three guest speakers who will share with us their research and practice in their input presentation. Dr. Elia Horn is a lecturer and researcher at the Humanistische Hochschule Berlin. After studying Indology and educational science, he completed his PhD in the field of educational history. For his PhD, he investigated how German new educationists and members of the German youth movement during the Weimar Republic perpetuated Orientalist discourses while engaging with mostly religious ideas of Indian origin. In addition to these topics, he has also published on sex education and its history. He currently works at the Humanistische Hochschule Berlin in the area of teaching training. In addition to lecturing, he is involved in the creation of a framework curriculum for the school subject Humanistische Lebenskunde. And he is also an anti-discrimination trainer. Habiba Insaf is a PhD candidate at the Center for Anthropological Research on Museums and Heritage at the Humboldt University Berlin. Her research examines the politics of display and interpretation of Indian objects in Berlin State Museums. Her decades of professional work span the fields of art history, museum education, and museum studies. She has been invited to speak at the Jaipur Literature Festival, the Humboldt Forum, and the Ashoka University. I'm moving the presentation, I'm sorry. Yeah. Habiba's writing includes reviews on contemporary art and essays on popular culture, museums, and decolonization. She's a recipient of the Gerda Henkel Foundation Doctoral Fellowship, the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation German Chancellor Fellowship, the Singapore International Foundation's Art for Good Fellowship, and the Prince Carlos Fund. And yeah, Sayan Mani is an interdisciplinary artist and curator, hailing from a family of rubber tappers in a remote village in the northern part of Kerala in South India. His work gives voice to the issues of marginalized and oppressed peoples of India via the black Dalit body of the artist. Mani's performance practice insists upon embodied presence, confronting pain, shame, fear, and power. His personal trysts with his body as a meeting point of history and present opens into body as a socio-political metaphor. His praxis excavates the artist's biography in relation to colonial history, ecological issues, and material relations. Sayan Mani was the first Indian to be awarded the Berlin Art Prize in 2021. He has participated in international biennials, festival exhibitions, and residencies, including, for example, the Inhabit in the Max Planck Institute, the Kochi Biennale, and in addition, he received an artistic research grant from the Berlin Senat and the Akademie Schloss Solitude Fellowship. He has also been awarded with the Prince Claus Mentorship and the Artist of the Year by the Hello India Art Awards. Thank you again for accepting our invitation. And we will move now to your input presentations.
I'm standing up, so you can see. I've only got two hands. Where's my third hand? Tonight, thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here and to shed some light on the area of new education and their perception of India, which can be said to be a part of Indomania in Germany during the 1920s, during the Weimar Republic, basically. The point I would like to make is that the topos of nature was one important link to connect new educationist ideas to Orientalist imaginations of India. Well, German new education was thoroughly influenced by Romanticism. Broadly speaking, German Romanticism regarded nature and civilization as contradictory. Against the backdrop, just the next, please. Against the backdrop of profound social and cultural change that took place around 1800, they cultivated a yearning for the golden age, which you can see behind me, that is for nature, for originality, so to say. As opposed to Enlightenment philosophy, Romanticism favored imaginations of childhood and of India. Oh, thank you very much. All right. Of childhood and of India. This is important because this is the connecting point I would like to focus on tonight, and that developed in a parallel process during the Romanticist era. Okay, the next, please. German Romanticists conceived India as the paradisiac origin of humanity. In his philosophy of history, Johann Gottfried Herder, a forerunner of Romanticism, linked India to childhood by intertwining phylogenesis and ontogenesis, that is, the history of mankind with the history of humanity as a whole. And the history of mankind, with the history of an individual, of course. That is the linking point. Consequently, both India and childhood were assigned the same place. That is, the origin, so to say, and in this way they were naturalized both. Larger parts of the German Reformpädagogik, which is the German expression for new education, experienced modern civilization as a threat too, just the same as the Romanticists did. They sought refuge in nature or wished to reclaim their origins in imagined glorious traditions. The next presentation. And I also have to warn you, I forgot to say it in the beginning, I also have to reproduce racist ideas in my presentations. So according to what I just said, Elisabeth Rotten, a German editor of a new educationist journal, proclaimed Europe to be in danger. It needed to stop its self-mutilation, that's a quotation, and should step out into the wholeness of life. Rotten presented India as an example since it brings forth to us the promise of a new form of the survival of the fittest. Those whose lives are based on the unifying forces of love will prevail, she said. So, nature was an eminent reference in German new education. As regards their pedagogy, new educationists claimed to follow a natural method based on the child nature. That is a child-centered pedagogy they wanted to advocate. It should enable students to grow into their natural selves, and the idea of the child nature was essentially romanticist. The next, please. German romanticists had believed childhood to be the only nature that was not yet mutilated amongst the cultivated humanity. To them, children were ideal human beings representing purity, originality, and fantasy as an expression of natural creativity, as also as here depicted in this very famous romanticist image by Runge, the Hülsenbeckschen Kinder. By linking this romantic ideal to Rousseau's optimistic anthropology, to eugenic concepts, and to a cultural criticism, Ellen Key, the next please, pioneer of new education, drafted her image of the child in 1900. She attributed the child an exalted nature before which parents were to bow their heads. Children, according to Key, represented the future. That is why parents had no right to prescribe laws for them. Since nature would fashion neither parents nor children for education, Key concluded that natural education meant not to educate. Karl Wilker, now I come to the next protagonist here, new educationist director of a protectorate in Berlin, actually, during the last years of the First World War, and fellow campaigner of Elisabeth Rotten, linked this notion of education to a romantic image of India. The next, please. You can see it behind me. He wrote a review on Dan Gopal Mukherjee's novel Kari the Elephant. And in reviewing this novel, he wrote, "It contains such a wealth of simplest pedagogic wisdom that a university professor's lecture on education would appear downright poor. This pedagogy is not intended. It is truly natural," he wrote. According to Wilker, so to say, Mukherjee's novel represented a pedagogy of life that came along with being Indian or living in India. So this is where he put the link. By saying so, Wilke addressed the new educationist idea that nature was a perfect environment for growth and learning. Amongst German new education, especially proponents of country boarding schools, Landerziehungsheime, they pinned their educational hopes on non-urban surroundings. That is nature. We could also recognize it in Sol's presentation with the girls that were also placed in a natural setting. Romanticist imaginations of India were thus prone to be referred to. German romanticists had regarded India not only as a prehistoric place, but combined the supposed originality with notions of childhood. For example, with Joseph Goeritz, he said, you can read it behind me, "Do you know the land where youthful humanity spent her happy childhood years where the gods descended to their favorites and took part in their cheerful play, our soul is drawn to the banks of the Ganges and Indus. And so on, it's a little bit shortened. India was imagined, so to say, as a sort of paradise, as a land of naturally good beings that did not need education. Rather, this nature needed to be enabled to unfold. This notion can be found in several pieces of Romanticist writing. I can talk about it a little bit later if you want to talk to me about it. From 1920 onwards, the topic of child nature and nature of India were commonly linked to new educationist concepts. Next, please. In 1931, at a boarding school called Odenwaldschule, a famous boarding school near Heidelberg, for instance, the students and teachers engaged in discussions about outdoor lessons. Next. By then, journals had repeatedly been featuring reports of the joyful children that studied at Tagore's school in Shantiniketan while sitting under trees. Paul Geheb, head of the Odenwaldschule and ardent admirer of Tagore, next please, is reported to have said in a school assembly, "From Tagore, we learn a lot about the value of working in nature. However, Indians are much more in touch with nature. We should be able to achieve it too." Just by the way, Geheb had also a strong liking for Mukherjee's novels, and he read them aloud and during school meditations to the students. And some of them, like Margaret, the next please, was very, they enjoyed these readings a lot, and they felt touched by the images that Mukherjee's writings evoked. She wished to be in touch. She wished to be in such beautiful places as well, and she did draw a nice picture. As regards the outdoor lessons, the Odenwald school teacher Walter Brenning had its doubts. "We just don't have the Indian attitude," he said, "towards nature. We only observe that students are less focused and bring poor results with outdoor lessons." This assembly took place only a few days after Tagore's 60th birthday. The next, please. In a letter of congratulation, Geheb had praised Tagore to have liberated education from pedagogy in Shantiniketan. I quote, "I know you as the ingenious herald of the child's soul. You succeeded in allowing human beings to naturally develop into children of God, sheltered from any sort of adult violence." Geheb signed the letter as, I quote, "your grateful disciple," thus declaring Tagore to be his teacher. To summarize, Indomania amongst German new education found its expression in linking romanticist images of both India and childhood to their education. India as a metaphor of originality and a child nature that was not yet corrupted by modernity represented the ideal of natural education that did not need pedagogy. The educational relationship was rhetorically turned around. Childhood and India became the true educators. Yet these images were charged with eugenic and culturally racist concepts. Karl Heinrich Becker, chairman of the German section of the New Education Fellowship, which was a global fellowship of new educationists, expressed this tendency when he said that the new educationists declared belief in the child's individuality implied the approval of racial individuality. The new education, and I quote again the last of my, he said, "The new education can receive worldwide recognition only when it accepts the varying basis of different cultures. The Orientals," and he basically addressed Indians by saying so, "will only then become equals when they stop imitating us." I thank you very much.
Let me start by thanking Sol for this beautiful evening, and to Lee, Freya, Professor Sawa, and the whole team of KuK-Tuesdays. Okay, I have to start. Oh, sorry. Okay, for the camera, sorry. Okay. I must start with a disclaimer that I think my presentation has more questions than concrete comments or analysis. So this is a part of my PhD, and let me begin my presentation by offering 2 points of departure, which are of my research, ongoing research, which looks at exhibiting India in German museums. Slide, please. So let me start with talking about Indomania and collecting. Since the time of Alexander, India held great interest for Europe. Political, military, and diplomatic contacts between Europe and India intensified in the 16th century. By the 18th century, Indian literature featured in German Romanticism. Strong linguistic ties were established between Sanskrit and German. Indology became an integral part of German Bildung and Kultur. And Indian texts and concepts were drawn upon by leading German philosophers and thinkers such as Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. Regrettably, this enduring engagement with Indian thought also contributed directly to the development of Nazi ideology in the 20th century. In short, India has had an enduring presence in German intellectual life. Despite a long-standing Indian preoccupation, Raymond Schwab argues that European fascination with India fell short of an aesthetic appreciation of visual arts of India. Now, this phenomena, which has been termed as paradox of reception by Partha underscores a notable gap in the aesthetic understanding of Indian visual art, despite sustained European preoccupation with India. Now, the systematic collection of Indian artifacts in Europe did not commence until the late 19th century. Notably, among the collected items were Buddhist sculptures, particularly those from Gandhar, which exhibited aesthetic qualities which were similar to those of Western art. Now, this development raises question about the nature of India that Europe sought to study and collect. So now, within the framework of Indomania, which India was being collected and studied by Europe? How did this enduring fascination with India translate into the epistemic framing of Indian objects? Slide. My second point of departure is museums and decolonization. Now, as many of us know, over the past decade, a global surge in demand to address legacies of colonialism, aided by strong political and intellectual movements, advocating cultural restitution, has put a spotlight on museums. This is because museums are identified as institutions not just born of colonialism, but as having actively shaped and upheld colonial theories of European cultural superiority, many of which have significant ramifications in the present. Growing calls for decolonization in museums have centered around demands for the return of non-European objects, a re-examination of labels, and reinterpretation of their overall collection, and greater participation of the community who made and owned the objects. Yet, lesser discussed aspect of this decolonial turn in museums is the lumping together in public discussion of all non-European objects in European museums with a similar violent past of unwillful removal from their place of origin. Furthermore, there is a prevailing assumption that these objects uniformly underwent similar treatment within European museums, that they have journeyed on a well-trodden path of being labeled first as curiosities, later as ethnographic objects, and then exhibited as products of a dead, unchanging, primitive culture. Now, such an assumed trajectory appears over-generalized. While they share a fate of displacement within Western museums, their acquisition histories and the many uses that they were subjected to often differ significantly. Slide, please. Much is known about the purposes that Indian material culture acquired through colonial programs of collecting by Britain and which served in furthering imperial agendas and legitimizing colonialism. Lesser known, however, is the context behind the acquisition of a vast corpus of Indian objects by countries such as Germany that did not share a colonial relation with India. In what way did the trans-cultural relation between India and Germany's position in European geopolitical landscape have a bearing on the way Indian objects came to be acquired, classified, and arranged in German museums? Recognizing that not all objects shared the same fate in European museums and acknowledging the differences in the shaping of narratives and practices of collection and display, it follows that a blanket association of imperialist ambition among all European nations towards non-European, predominantly colonized nations is an oversimplification that does not withstand scrutiny. How do the political relations between the European nations that collected these objects and the respective countries or communities of origin where these objects come from impact the reception of these objects? To what extent do narratives generated within Oriental scholarship, art history, archaeology, contributed by both European and homegrown scholars elevate certain non-European objects while relegating others to the periphery of artistic significance? Additionally, how is the hegemonic concept of a nation state tied to the centrality or marginalization of objects in exhibitions, thereby reinforcing notions of a dominant community, language, and people? Slide, please. Okay, so with these many questions in mind, I take the long-standing political and intellectual engagements between India and Germany as the starting point to examine the display and interpretation of Indian objects in 3 of Berlin's national museums, Staatliche Museen, the Ethnological Museum, the Asian Art Museum, and the Museum of Islamic Art. And the last slide. So to elucidate the diverse reception of Indian cultural artifacts in Germany, I trace the museum lives of 3 Indian objects, each originating from distinct museum collections in Berlin. In doing so, I argue that each of these objects is linked with a distinct facet of India, embodying divergent forms of knowledge about India. So the first object is a sculpture of the Hindu god Vishnu, and it comes from the Hindu heritage of India. The second one is a Murakka folio, or an album folio, and it comes from the Indo-Islamic heritage. And the third is a Naga textile, and it comes from what is framed as tribal, quote-unquote, heritage of India. So now in my exploration of museum lives of objects, my primary concern is to delineate the epistemic shifts and the changes in the display vocabulary of each object. So I will stop here, but maybe we can take this up more in the discussion of these objects later. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. I express my gratitude for the warm invitation extended to me. I would like to acknowledge and appreciate the efforts of everyone who involved conceiving and organizing this event. Thank you. Gazed lands. Recycling selected visuals from the 3 produced film, Das Indische Grabmal, 1921, 1938, 1959, and its second part, Der Tiger von Eshnapur, I have rediscovered Indianness as an ambiguous cultural construct made in Europe and assembled in India. As an artist living in Berlin, who is local in Kerala, South India, I have been facing the question, are you really Indian? We have seen Indians on TV, they are much fairer. Unleashing his custodian angst in answer, I have carefully selected the architectural blunders, cultural appropriation, and racial coalescences of exoticization and othering, embodied in the film, and makes a potpourri of visceral images with video text. In this journey in search of the shooting location, I have come across nuanced spatial politics of visual representation and the heterotopic transformations of places by time, and found the inexpedient footages of Rudersdorf and its open cast limestone mines, some of them metamorphosized into museums. The blackened faces of white actors who acted as Indians, as extravagantly costumed Maharajas and Maharanis, the wooden drama, more than life structures of everyday objects, the representation of the Orient, encapsulated in sheer ignorance in the film, resurface in this work to mirror Europe. My attempt is to voice the disarticulated intensities of non European subjects, both human and animal, buried, muted in the image archives of Europe. I excavated these visual imaginations from German movie history and used that materials for my works. I have performed the spaces where the movie showed and also inside the movie and with the movie to disrupt. In my practice as an interdisciplinary artist, and I'm trying to make sense of me as an artist and in a migrant body here in Berlin, Germany, these impulses makes me to create different artistic investigations. Counter gaze. I'm trying to delve into different archives to look for traces of our grandmothers, grandfathers, and more than human ancestors in order to create new speculative imaginations and histories as a form of resistance to hegemonic histories and knowledge production. I'm exploring archives in Germany and Switzerland, including the Ethnological Museum in Berlin and the Basel Missionary Archives. One iteration of this collective body is Sergeant Money or Sergeant Baraka Prabil Kolavan Money. I have found I have shocked by seeing one of the exhibition catalog from Ethnographical Museum Berlin. These are the same time, 1920s. So another anthropologist was going to Kerala. There starts the story of this multidisciplinary artistic research journey. I have initiated the project called Wake Up Call for My Ancestors. Colonial archives in different museums and institutions across Europe generate multiple discourses related to history, memory, archiving, art, and authenticity of the colonized nations. Wake Up Call for My Ancestors is a long-term critical artist archivist project to give an active call to the muted voices of the Dalit and other archived subaltern subjects who are being appropriated, exhibited, accessed, edited, and disseminated as mere photographs. Focusing particularly on the collection of South Indian photographs kept in the Ethnographical Museum Berlin, I have started an interdisciplinary dialogue inviting artists and researchers for a reflective critique on the Eurocentric archiving practices. The project actively hosts internal workshops, research papers, installations, performance, films, photographs, panel discussions, interactions, and experimental collaborations for a deliberative counter moment to reject the excatitude of colonial photography. In search of a space and history from below, Wake Up Call for My Ancestors integrates the widely accepted post-colonial methodology of engaging the big nation at the cost of minor locations like Kerala. this work is also another iteration of the same journey. And why rubber? Rubber came to my life also through colonization. My parents were rubber tappers. So rubber came through British colonialism from Malay, Singapore, I mean, not from Malay, from South Americas as a looted indigenous knowledge and came to Kerala through British colonialism. But it became part of my life. This is one of the work I have collaborated with my father. So that's why I'm using natural rubber, raw rubber sheet in my work. So these works is also based on the colonial photographs which I found from the archives in Berlin. And some of the iterations are these. But artistic imaginations is not, sorry, artistic imaginations is fine, but since I have the opportunity to be in Europe, I have the historical responsibility to share these newly found photographs and archive material to Malayalis, the people from Kerala. So, in collaboration with Dr. Vinil Paul, a Dalit historian, we started publishing these photographs in Madhrubhumi Weekly, which is a Malayalam magazine, and have estimated circulation of 60,000 copies each week and an approximate readership of 300,000. And now many young researchers are using these materials to start research and using it as a starting point to find new ways to excavate. And I think that is more important for us. And another iteration of this project will come very soon in the project called Speaking to Ancestors. And the curators of the project also helped me to find these photographs from the archives. And it's not easy. So access should be a question when we speak about archives. Thank you. Let's do.
that was a great final image of Indomania, of course, with these dancers like imitating some, I don't know, Bharatanatyam or who knows, trying to do it. Yeah, that were three very interesting insights in your different research and practices. Yeah, thank you. I prepared three general questions for you three, and then we could open the floor to the audience to your own questions. Yeah, I wanted to begin our conversation by rethinking the concept of Indomania and problematizing it as a Western construction. I had, two lines to clarify a bit, maybe the definition. We use this term Indomania similarly to the concept of Orientalism, coined by Edward Said, but we define this case of the German fascination with India and its entanglements with the powers dynamics of imperialism, since Said didn't related to this relationship between Germany and India, but he mainly focused on French and English literature related to the so-called MENA region, no? Middle East and North Africa. I wanted to problematize a bit like this kind of research, or also as I did at the beginning. However, while deconstructing and analyzing these power dynamics, we also reproduce them. And with this in mind, my first question will be, even some of you have already speak about that, maybe you can elaborate about a bit more with more different words. So how do we avoid reproducing Orientalist gaze? How do you deal with this problem in your own research and practice? Or rather, how do you find counter narratives? Yeah. I think you have another microphone, but...
All right, then I just say something. Well, it's just it's an interesting question because it's on the one hand it's a theoretical problem, how to understand Orientalism as a discourse theory, and on the other hand, of course, as we have seen also with Sajjan's work, it's something that is very practical. It's something that is there in everyday life, and I mean, to go back to Said was very clear. He said there is no way to not to be Orientalist when Westerns speak about the Orient. So that's what he said. So, well, one could make a point there. And of course, there has been more ideas developed after Said. I'm not a theorist, but just one thing that comes to my mind is the idea of hybridity, which can be a way to get beyond this Orientalism. And so, well, I mean, from a point of view that I'm taking as an anti-discrimination trainer, I would say just in the same way as sexism or racism, we are, or let me speak about myself as a person who has grown up in Germany and is white. Well, it's in my bones, yeah, and what I can do is to reflect on it. That's what I can do. And to critically reflect, of course.
Thank you.
I can offer some things from my scope of research. As I already said, when you talk about Indomania, I think there was a certain obsession or fascination with certain kind of India, certain strand of Indian history. And when I'm writing these the museum lives of objects, it's basically a study of the object. So I'm trying to see how German museums, or in particular Berlin museums, have looked at this object. So there is a lot of problematic language, text as well. And while I'm trying to narrate it, I also question, am I reproducing it, right? Because I also want the readers to know, oh no, but this is not the reality. This is, but at the same time, I also want to keep a certain distance from it and want it to be be a reflection of how the museum has interpreted that object, how it has kind of given it a certain life in its institution. So yeah, that is something that, I think same with art historians, when you're kind of sharing images, you're also like, but you have to show it to kind of, then open it up for debate and critical reflection. So I think I face that as well. Yeah, and again, I feel like the imagination, and as I'm also writing, like for example, when I'm writing about the Naga object, which is a tribal, quote unquote, the kind of text that is written about it is very different as compared to when I'm talking about a Vishnu sculpture. It's very, very different. The language is very different. The kind of attributions, the kind of appreciation or lack of appreciation, it's totally divergent in their case studies. And then the Islamic object has a completely different narrative to it. So what is their idea of India? What do they really classify it as India? And also, what is the Orient for them? It's also because somehow India also, I think, does not neatly fit into the Orient, but yet it is the Orient. And also, specifically when you talk about Islamic objects from India, that has its own problems, because again, it is it is in between. It's like, again, it is Islamic, so it has to be Orient, but it is from India, so is it really Orient,
Thank you, Habiba.
I think through my artistic practice, I'm trying to reflect on these questions. Yeah, but I would like to add one thing with Habiba. We are sharing many questions together. When I went to the collections, I can't show those images here. I don't have the right to show. There is a lot of objects specifically from Kerala, but the museum don't have the capacity to or the knowledge to understand from where it is. So even though the objects have the names of the places and also Malabar, the people could understand what is Malabar than the Indian subcontinent. So these kind of complexities is there. So this categorization is very interesting. Still, this knowledge is so solid, this categorization knowledge. So somehow to disrupt that knowledge system is something which is needed, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, it seems that there are also different subcategorization in India. No, you were showing it very, very well, and with the case of South India or Kerala, is also different. So my second topic I'd like to discuss with you is related to your approach to the colonial museums and archives. You already, Sayan, addressed to that. Yeah, in a way. So, and also with when dealing with literary sources. and this approach in relation with your own positionality and your very different backgrounds. Since our first session of the Dislocation series, we have been reflecting on these complexities related to colonial archives mainly, such as their gaps, their inaccessibility. You also mentioned that, Sayan, but also on how delving into these archives could imply a potentially re-traumatic experience of colonialism. So my question will be, how do you navigate these complexities in these spaces or institutions and from your own position? I mean, it's a question for you three, but of course you can respond as you prefer.
I think at least my concern or the way that navigating through these collections is different, because as I told you, like, I was so surprised that because we don't have that kind of a history for Dalit and marginalized people even in India. So India don't have that kind of, I mean, of course, you can argue that it's in the bodies, it's in the land, and it's the water, and oral traditions and so on. But in the form of a photograph, or and also the objects. So it's a really important material to work with, even with these complexities and problems that it carries. But it also gives a space to study and to create and also to imagine with it. So, yeah, I mean, I was like, I mean, not only this archives, my mother tongue Malayalam has a very complex socio-political history to Germany. So in Tübingen University's archives have Malayalam's first dictionary, the manuscripts of the first Malayalam dictionary is there. So Herman Hesse's grandfather was working in Kerala as a missionary, but he was also a linguist. So when I touched that material, and I also used these materials to create new works, but also a lot of materials even Malayalis don't know. Even like at that time, they produced a lot of illustrated magazines and so on, and it's kept in here. So to get that access, even though with the difficult navigation, it's actually a very interesting, different knowledge positions for us. That's why I pointed the access, because it's I don't know, we have to change, not we, but maybe, the point of interest maybe to change a little bit. I hope I answered.
Yes, of course. And yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to add what Sajan already said about accessibility, because I also work with these museum archives. I think one large problem, maybe some of us are already aware, is that there is so much material, but no one knows where it is, And again, it's a question of labor. They are so understaffed. There is no funding to hire people. And most of the labor is women working there in those spaces, right? So it's also like creates a certain accessibility issue. So things are slow to move. I think it's again, there is so much of history, so much of material documentation that it really surprises me that, wow, there is so much of it. But which file, which folder, where is it? It all takes time to kind of, reveal itself. And then that also makes you wonder, like, what are our priorities and where are the funds going, Is it not about archiving and is it not about research?
So it's very messy and we don't have the knowledge also. Elia, maybe do you want to add anything, I don't know, related like with your work dealing with the literary sources or images?
Yeah, not much really. It's what I could add, maybe thinking about the question you asked before, is of course to end muting the Orient, so to say, to let people speak and not to just let the Europeans speak, not only the white perspective, which is for the archives that I have seen, the pedagogical archives, school archives, and so on. It's basically the white perspective there. And that's what my focus was on, of course, because I'm not here to be the channel for Indian voices, of course. My perspective was on the perception of the white German perception of what they thought was India. And of course, Indian voices are amongst these pieces in the archives, and it's a project to let them speak, of course. Yes, let them speak.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point also, how to find these voices, no, in the archives. So I don't know, we have the light and now we can see you, but still I'm going to ask a last question because we have time, I think. So we were here like in an hour conversation, I was thinking, until now. And my third question is related to what we have called, also with the ideas of my colleagues, restitution of knowledge. I'd like to hear more about your activities related to mediation in museums, for example, or education, or also your engagement with different communities. So who are your audiences beyond academia and how do you engage with them?
Make it short, I've got no audience but academic. I'm not an activist. I was a researcher and that's it. So sorry, I have to admit.
But I mean, you were, sorry to interrupt, but you are also working now like teaching and with this more, I don't know, maybe you have some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I'm into teacher training these days, and you can find, if you've got your career plans not finished yet, you can come to the Humanistischer Verband and become a Lebenskunde teacher, and you will end up in my classes. So what I'm doing is some sort of pedagogy that is aware of discrimination, and I want to. I want to bring this point into my classes. So, but what I focus on is sexism, homophobia, and this is my main point within this, because I'm really not the person to speak about racism. I've got to speak about critical whiteness maybe, but this is too specific for my classes. It's too specific knowledge, historical knowledge. It's mostly too much for students who just want to become teachers. This sounds bad now, but it's really too specific. You've got, if you're working in history, you've got to have so much knowledge about the context, the historical context, and it's too broad. It's really too much input. Then sorry.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to this regard either, but before I entered academia, started my PhD, I did make my bread and butter from museum education, and also largely education, before that, but I'm not doing any of that work in Berlin. So, yeah.
Um, Obviously, through this publication, um, we are trying to reach more people in Kerala, so not necessarily Berlin. Because as I told you before, it's a big opportunity to be in Europe and try to get access this and to share people there. Because even I know people who can't publish their books because the copyright issue is that much problematic. So they couldn't get even the photos to get published, and So these questions are there. Yeah, I mean, restitution, I'm not the right candidate to talk about that. I think then restitution, we don't want anything now. We just want to get access.
It's a first step, I imagine. Yeah.
Sorry. I mean, maybe, India is also moving. India is now also not one homogenetic reality. So there is a lot of historical narratives many post-colonial countries wants, So where to restitute and what is also a question. That's why.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your responses. And now we can open the discussion to you, to the audience. I don't know if is there any questions?
Hi, everyone. Hi, Habiba. Hi, Sajan. Um, I had a, I mean, this is for Habiba actually, because I'm also from the Northeast, much like the Nagas are. And one of the things that sort of struck me when I was looking at this Humboldt Forum thing is that, the Humboldt Forum sort of is, sorry to any Humboldt Forum people here who might be on Team Humboldt Forum, is this particular kind of politics where we kind of see that, but the Nagas have been fighting against the, Indian nation state the whole time. I mean, you've probably already seen their museum text. And then suddenly one who is, say, us who kind of, exactly as Sajan mentioned here, that there are so many narratives within post-colonial India that we would have to take account of just to be able to make any kind of justice out of this, right? Is how do you see, this is like, I don't expect you to have the 100% answer, but this is something I deal with in my research as well. How do we think of conceptualizing categories within a post-colonial nation state when we're talking about art, when we're talking about archives, while we are also dealing with claims that are always within or always about to be appropriated by, I don't know, if you go into Nagaland here, it could be Naga Lim, could be the Naga Ho, the Naga whatever, NSCN, IM, or the other side, the Kaplan group. And we don't know, right? So how do you see that in your research work? I'm very curious. Thank you.
Thanks, Priyam, for the question. So as I'm also writing, all of these objects, they have their own issues, and one, like the issue with the Naga object, you kind of summarized it. But I'm still thinking about it. I'm still sort of, my thoughts are still being marinated, so to say. What is the answer to this? I mean, there are definitely problems in the way the museums categorize these objects. So then do we produce new classifications on top of it? because the minute you do that, there will be new emergent problems out of that. And then I question, do we need any kind of classification? But then we need some form of order, otherwise it's too much chaos, right? And so yeah, it's a difficult sort of a dilemma to come out of so easily. But yet I feel like these classifications they produce very productive tensions, so to say, right? Because it kind of tells you where you are falling short of, why this classification is not working. So I think it has a certain gain. And yeah, when you talk about like future making, right? Like it's the same thing. Like you can keep imagining something better for this object, right? So like, for example, when you take the Naga object and you're like, okay, maybe it should all go back. And then you feel like, where will it go back? And then you see it. So when you see the Kohima State Museum and you're like, oh gosh, not here, So so those kind of things. So where do you see the future of this object is again an open question, because again, there are layers of hegemonic structuring in India as well, the kind of museums, and it would be placed in a so-called tribal museum, or it would be, so it has its own problems. So you're not really extricating it from a so-called poor place to a better, brighter future. So that's also not happening. And similarly with also other objects that I kind of look at. Yeah, but I feel like it's something, I don't think it can be resolved, especially with ethnographic museums, and there is, I feel, it's a constant process of changing and change making that needs to follow, but there is no definitive answer. And I know anybody who's worked in ethnographic museum knows, anything you do, it will be critiqued, right? So it's a very difficult position to be in as well. Yeah.
Hi. My question is to all three of you. I'm curious how you observe this Indomania in contemporary development in each of your fields. So whether it's in the field of literature or museum collections, how museum collections are expanding in Berlin, or in image practices in relation with India. What are your observations about this, and whether you see it as very practical in its and quick in its, because it's understaffed and not well thought out. For like one thing I'm thinking about now is the Documenta cancellation and Ranjit Hoskote's resignation being a result of something very specific to the Indian context and its relation to what's the Hindutva thing there, and it's how that is related to Zionism. And so when he makes a statement there, and then that has repercussions here 3 years, 4 years later, so this seems like a very quick decision. So I'm wondering how you see, I gather that even museum collections work something like this in a very practical, jhatpat way. So yeah, I'm just wondering, what are your observations on the contemporary Indomania in your fields?
Thank you, Paro, for the question. I think you had two questions. Right, there are two different questions, sort of related. I can just very quickly talk about museum collecting and Indomania, if there is, in contemporary museum collecting. I mean, I'm not somebody who's analyzing the trends of how purchases are being made and whether it's going up or down, and especially in museums. I'm not talking about contemporary art, but say more ancient or medieval. I think museums, especially in the past few years, with like lots of issues related to Indian objects in museums, like Subhash Kapoor and his gallery and all those smuggled objects. I think museums are now more careful with terms of documentation and like what kind of objects we bring in now in the present. So therefore, a lot of objects, the way, the speed, the ease with which objects came in the 19th century or till the earlier 20th century, we don't have something like that. So that kind of collecting practice, if we look at Indomania in that sense, I don't think that exists anymore. Yeah, that would be my brief answer about museum collecting. But maybe the others can comment more about contemporary art.
Contemporary. Not about education. I must agree, I don't think Indomania is there any longer in that sense that we talked about, or that I talked about it as a phenomenon of romanticism, basically. But what I see are traces of Indomania in, not actually in education right now. I can't hardly say anything about it, but where I see it is in basically in the public sphere. Generally, it is there in practices, like what I've observed lately is that mostly movements, social movements from the right, from the political right, take up practices that are supposed to be Indian. I mean, how to say it now? I mean, they are not practicing Indian practices, of course, but they are appropriating something. And what I have heard is that there is a neo-fascist sect in Switzerland. They are singing Indian mantras. And also what I've seen is the big demonstrations against Corona politics here in Germany. There was a person who is calling himself Swami so-and-so or Guru so-and-so. I forgot the proper name he used. But he made the whole demonstration sing Hare Krishna, Hare Rama. And so there were thousands of German protesting people going through Berlin singing Hare Krishna, Hare Rama against Corona. So this is what I see, and these are traits of the romanticist Indomania. These are images of India that are reproduced in a way that we want back our nature, we want back our originality, we want back our Germanness, because Germanness is also can be traced back to India, because there are our roots. That's the racist idea behind it, and so it's been taken up again, and it's on one side it's ridiculous, on the other side it's horrible. I mean, I get goosebumps and I get afraid of it. Yeah.
Sorry, when you were showing this 1920s education, how this romanticism in Indomania is being used here, so it's very fascinating, because the same time Egon von Eichstätt, the photographer, ethnographer, he later became a really leading racial theorist of Nazi Germany. And he went to Shantiniketan and took the photos of Tagore and all of these teachers. It's really complex and interesting. So even Indomania is also really complex, I think. I'm not an academic, I'm just, as an artist point, I'm trying to reflect on that. Maybe Indomania now, maybe like this, and I'm more like India as a big market. That mania is also there, maybe?
Yeah, I wanted to actually ask exactly that question. And I think that what you no, yeah, waves in these demonstrations against COVID. That's interesting point, of course, but also related to what you now were addressing to is like if you, I don't know if it's a easy question, but if is there any reception of this Western Indomania in India, in some, I don't know, like in museums, in these categories in museums, or in the Indian nationalism, or I don't know. I've seen, for example, in Tagore, he has an essay on Shakuntala, on this ancient Indian play based on Goethe interpretation of this, quoting a poem of Goethe. So I see there is also some, I don't know, like a mirror of Indomania in some waves, of course, not always, but in some, I imagine, Indian elites. I don't know if you have, you can answer.
Maybe I start because you mentioned Tagore. He's a nice example of how Indomania mirrored back into India itself. He was traveling Europe with a speech called let me think now. Something about the forest. I only remember the forest. And the forest is like, there was a hysteria about Tagore here in Germany during the 1920s. People fell unconscious because he was there, and also his appearance was the perfect Oriental. Now he had his long beard and long white hair and sort of a kaftan dress, and he was also putting himself in scene as someone who wanted to be perceived as a prophet or something like that, and he was perceived as a prophet. And if we go back to India, there was a lot of reception of this Indomania, and it can be shown also in some pedagogical spaces in India, for example, in the Gurukul schools, that are schools that appeared at the beginning also of the 20th century, and they were Hindu nationalist schools, and they wanted to reproduce this. I mean, this is really cut very short. It's more complex, of course, but in a nutshell, they wanted to reproduce this idea of the ideal Indian, but not the soft Indian. That was the little change they made, but a strong Indian, an Indian man that was strong and not soft and effeminate. So this is just one example how Indomania mirrored back. And so also I mean, it's in Germany we say the steile These, but I say it now. I think that the Hindutva that we can see now in India, the political right in India, is just one of the results of this German Indomania. It's one of the results, maybe it's a long trace, but it's one of the results, I think, that come back from Indomania. But you also wanted to say something.
No, I just wanted to add that there is absolutely no doubt that Indians themselves have profited from this kind of self-ethnologizing project that came with Indomania. So to kind of be perfect examples of an Oriental imagination and, profit from it.
I don't know. Sayan, do you want to add anything? No, not now. Yeah, many hands.
Hello, thank you so much. It was super interesting, all your comments and perspectives on the topic. I'm really new to this Indomania. So I want to come back to the discourse of Orientalism and how you really showed that there like specific perspective of Orientalism and the imaginary of Indomania is connected to nature and the body and essentializing the body. And I was wondering, because I have a background in African history, African art and history, and they're like the discourse of primitivism and is more connected to wildness and authenticity and also essentialization, which all was undermined to present African cultures as without history and without culture, and especially without history. And I was wondering if Indomania is also constructed as an, I don't know, no civilization and without history, and all this was the Western different or differentiated from other cultures. Yeah.
Yeah.
You start. Just I grabbed it. Okay. I think it's an interesting question because I can't translate it in English, but the saying in German is as concerns African peoples is die edlen Wilden. And this is actually a contrary image to the Indomania, because Indomania was trying to trace back civilization to India as the root of civilization. So actually, they are not wild and primitive people, but they are the people that civilization is coming from. Die Wiege der Menschheit, the cradle of mankind, that is India. And so they are not the people from the wilderness with spears and feathers and things, you know. So this is the Orientals are different others than the African others, so to say. Is that?
Yeah, super. Yeah, thank you.
Do you want to add something?
I can add something. I agree, but I think there's also a lot of differing perspectives by different historians. Some do say that India had no history. Some say no, India had a history because you have the Vedas and Upanishads and the epics, right? So, like, does India have a civilization and history or not? I don't think there was a very clear perspective, but like with most things, there isn't. But when I'm looking at the museum and how the museum looks at India, they had a very clear idea of India. Most of India does not fit into ethnography. But they are also very clear that certain parts do. So when they talk about these certain parts, it's very geographically, culturally, and racially segregated. So, quote unquote, what they call tribal people were the indigenous people, and they had this whole Aryan invasion theory and all of that. So those people are definitely a focus of ethnographic study for them. They also believe that people of south of India were also indigenous because they had these racist notions, right? That north of India is the Aryan and the south of India is the defeated lower caste and groups. So they had specific areas that they had marked as these are the focus of ethnography. So it's not that they thought all of India was not a focus of ethnography, but large parts were not, but some of these parts were. And they focused very clearly in their catalogs. They write that we'll focus on objects from these communities, these geographies. So yeah, it was like, yeah, the kind of division, segregation, and the logic is amazing.
Yeah, Habiba pointed it out exactly. So from northeast to south, that is the two geographical points where Germans were going crazy. They have everything, even seeds. I seen seeds and clothes and so on. I think Adolf Bastian and this old Chittagong fascination with the Emil Ribbeck and all, this is all reflected on that. But Habiba clearly reflected, pointed out that. Yeah, and then, sorry, one thing just came to my mind. Some of the Indian and national poetry have this kind of link back, and that may be connected to this undertone of Aryan supremacy.
Yeah, thank you very much for the very interesting lectures. And I have one question, maybe Habiba, because it's also very connected to your recent answer about the reflection of the museum collections about India. And you are talking about, you found out the different style of writing about objects than you found. And I think it's very interesting because as a Korean person and curator, I think also in the Korean objects that they have was in a certain way of a kind of discrepancy to understand the past and present about culture. And so I think this is maybe in the same way or a similar way, but how do you think, what is a kind of difference that you find? I mean, and in a way, it lies on the discipline of the studies about art history that German museum people have, or it's kind of a cultural difference that they maybe in a way outdated. Or well, I'm still also wondering how you communicate with this kind of difference that you found with museum people. I mean, you are you are researcher, and then you are really delving into the archives of the museum. That how they are reactive or adaptive about your knowledge.
If I understood correctly, you're asking me what the differences were and if these differences still survive or are they being changed? Okay. I mean, a lot of these differences, I mean, there are many more, but this idea of an hegemonic India and how tribal or Islamic or Hindu or Buddhist objects, I mean, how they're classified, I mean, the entire life stories that, as I say, they are really different. I mean, there are traces of this even today. Like, for example, when you go to the Humboldt Forum, you go to the right if you want to see art, and what you see in sort of quote-unquote Indian art is Hindu, Buddhist sculptures. And then you take a left, and then you see ethnological collections, which I think it's a temporary exhibition, which has Naga exhibitions for now, and then it will be changed at some point, I think this year. So there is still a separation that exists between these objects. And then if you want to see Indo-Islamic objects, you have to go to the Museum of Islamic Art. Some are still there in the Asian Art Museum, or which was earlier the Indian Art Museum. So there are still, some objects are a part of it. Again, the way they frame it is, there's Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism, and then you have courtly art from the courts, which actually means Indo-Islamic art, you know. So also these kind of ideas of dividing it according to religions, you know, so there are like these traces that are still there. There are also some changes, some things that are moving ahead. There is more collaboration, more conversations with people from from India or from communities that the objects come from. I don't want to say India because it's really big, but communities that they come from. So there are also some changes. But again, a lot of the database, again, needs to be updated in terms of also, I mean, there are like really like small things, but like the use of the objects. So for example, the Naga object that I'm working with, so the case of the Naga object is very interesting because everything, like everything about the object that is being told through the institution crumbles when you dig deeper. So for example, the cloth is called a shawl. It's a body cloth, but it's called a shawl. And in the archives itself, you have a photograph of the person wearing it, you know, so like before it was acquired by the collector, Otto Ehlers. And you can see that it's the same shawl. And the person who's wearing the shawl is wearing, I mean, the shawl, he's not wearing it as a shawl, he's wearing it as a lungi, as like a cloth, right? As a wrapper. And why is it still being called a shawl? You know, and it's there in the same space. And I asked the curator, and he was like, "Oh, that's a good question." So it's, you know, it's these kind of things that, and I kept scratching my head. I'm like, have I not understood something about it? And I just asked, you know, like, what is it? Why is it a shawl? You know, so very simple nomenclature how you're calling the object, you know. So those things I think really need to be updated. It's not that they want to hide that it is not a shawl, you know, it's not, but it just, as I said, there's so much of data, there's so much of information, but who's sitting to kind of change and update and corroborate everything? So it's a slow process, I hope. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that discussion. I think one of the interesting points one can raise would be in how far can we avoid Indomania while doing post-colonial research or decolonial research on India and on colonialism itself in terms of striving for a step forward towards the ability granted to the cultures we used to label subaltern for the self-critique of one's own historical cultures. So the question would be in how far we can transcend the step of dismantling, the obvious necessary step of dismantling the traces and curtains of colonialism in order to allow the other, in quotation marks, to criticize him or herself as a culture, as a history. And how far are we in the museum culture and also in the discourse of our history ready to find the language of that kind of critique, of self-critique of the other, and what would be the instruments within that language? I'm thinking now about a very particular event in the Indian history of philosophy, a book published by Debi Prasad Chattopadhyaya in the late 60s when Foucault was a rising star in European philosophy. And the book is entitled Indian Atheism, a Marxist Analysis. Revolutionary, so far so good, Marxist analysis, but he returns to Nietzsche and to Schopenhauer, to Twilight of the Idols, and uses also somehow beyond Nietzsche and Lenin, also the missionary narrative. So this is where the image of the critique, how can it be pursued and perceived, becomes complex. What would be the instruments, and are we ready for that kind of place for self-critique of the other, quotation marks? Thank you.
Me? I'm the moderating. Or it was a comment very rich one. I don't know if you want to respond. Or we have. Or we have also time for one last question. Or you were like, okay, I've seen.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. It's interesting, it's complex, it's difficult. I've got no answer to it. I tried in my research to analyze how deep Orientalist thinking is there engraved in even education, even in new education. It's such a crazy thing like new education, which is of no much importance actually. But even there in this far-fetched space, we can find Orientalism, we can find Indomania, and so I think it's interesting for me as a white person to acknowledge the history that I'm living in and the racist and Orientalist history that I am part of. And yeah, to just make it visible, to make it perceptible, and not to let it vanish in the archives and become invisible. So maybe that's what I could say about it. It's not satisfying.
But I mean, yeah, the first step is to be aware of that Indomania or that, stereotypes, and to make them visible and try to trace them back different ways or to the contemporary world. We have time for a last question. Please.
I think it would be interesting to even because the moment we enter, I don't know, museum culture, art culture, education culture, right? It's interesting to understand at what point do we think of the self-criticism of the other as something that enters our ambit, right? So if there is a self-criticism of a brown person sitting on the stage or in India or somewhere in Kerala somewhere, right? At what point is it useful for somebody in Berlin or New York or Chicago or Switzerland to be sitting and talking about it? And I think this is where we sort of enter into the ambit within which knowledge, as you've mentioned in a way, kind of knowledge cultures come in insofar as at what point do we even think of the other as something that enters our mind? It is usually because Orientalism in many ways does create a use case of the category of the other, even when it comes to self-criticism of the other, to create a particular template that we can then, understand, like, oh, this is one way in which language was born. Look at those people sitting in, ethnography of the 1970s. I'm not saying that we're creating that, but I think probably one way of going into it, and I think this is part of the decolonizing, gesture, and Foga, who has spoken here before, has been very elegant in saying that why should my grandmother's dish ever interest you? Why do you want to put it in your museum? And I think that is always like an interesting, probably self-reflection to go into. So that. Sorry for taking over.
That were a great last remark and comment, of course. Also mentioning Foga and our last previous sessions. Thank you. you.